Much for joining us at the Business Ethics, CSR and Governance Research Cluster panel discussion on research academics as changemakers. My name is Dr. Sian Stevens and I am the Research Cluster co-lead, and I'll introduce my co-lead in a second. We're pleased to see so many people here to join us to see and hear from our brilliant panel of change makers, and we look forward to a lively discussion on an important topic. Just some housekeeping for the afternoon. Each of our panelists will give a brief presentation about their research and research impact. They'll do this consecutively, one after the other, and this will be followed by a response from Professor Emeritus Clive Morton. After this, we will open the floor for a discussion, and we encourage participation and questions for this bit. As I said, the presentations will be recorded, but the discussion will not be. We won't take questions during the presentation, but if you come up with a question and you're worried that you're going to forget it, then post it in the chat and I can read it out for you when the presentations are finished. Or you can just post in the chat that you have a question and I will call on you and you can use your own voice to ask the question when the speakers have finished speaking.
Okay.
The same process applies after the presentations are finished, so that there'll be a good chunk of time dedicated to talking amongst ourselves. But to keep things manageable, I ask you to post in the chat if you have a question. So you can either post your own question, post it, type it out, and I will read it out for you, or just post that you have a question and I will call on you to ask it yourself. Please do not speak until called on and stay muted at other times. If you do ask a question, it would be great if you could say who you are and where you're from or your affiliation, just so we can place you in the discussion. And if you want to use this as a networking opportunity as best you can, we would encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat during the presentations or during the Q&A. Note that there won't be an official break during the event. So what I've put in my notes is that you can do whatever you need to do to be comfortable at any point during the event. So if you need to get a drink or whatever, just don't wait for the break because there isn't one. So unless there's any questions about the housekeeping, I will introduce our panelists. And our first panelist is Dr. Andrea Werner, who is a senior lecturer in business ethics at Middlesex University. She's conducted research into the voluntary adoption of the real living wage by employers and submitted an impact case study for the REF 2021 based on her work. And she is also the research cluster co-lead. This will be followed by a presentation from Dr. Sepide Parsa, who is an associate professor in accounting at Middlesex and who conducts research into corporate accountability with a focus on labour rights. Then we will hear from Dr. Tim Freeman, who is the Associate Professor of Leadership at Middlesex University, possibly with a guest appearance from his co-conspirator Lillian Miles, who is a Senior Lecturer in Sustainability and Social Enterprise at Westminster. And they conduct research with migrant workers within the UK and Malaysia and reported in an impact study in REF 2021. We will then hear from Richard Scarlett, who is the Procurement and Development Manager at John Lewis Partnership, but is also a DProf student at Middlesex University, whose doctoral research explores how to achieve behavioural change towards sustainability in procurement professionals. And after these presentations, we will hear from Professor Emeritus Clive Morton, who will act as our discussant and a responder. And he will be reflecting on what we've heard based on his experience as an academic and business practitioner. And that is all I have to say. So I'll just give 30 seconds in case anyone has any questions about how anything's going to go from the presenters or the attendees. 30 seconds is probably too long. Okay, 30 seconds is up, and I will hand over to Andrea.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Excellent.
And just need to go into presentation mode.
Yeah, you've got that.
Okay, so that's me. So I wanted to talk about my research on the living wage, which I have been engaging in for the past 7-8 years or so. and the impact I was able to achieve. And I will also be reflecting on some of the challenges I have perceived in relation to my research and my intention to create impact with my research. So first, what is the research and why is it important? Now, the living wage, which is a wage rate calculated based on the cost of living, has been more and more recognized as an important mechanism to address problems arising from low wages and rising social inequality. And why is that important? It is important because often legally mandated minimum wages, which don't even always exist, they are usually too low to enable people to make ends meet. And this is not just a problem in developing economies, but also in the UK, where about a fifth of the workers in the UK are paid below the real living wage. Now, the response to this in recent years has been growing living wage movements. And in the UK, there is something called the Living Wage Foundation that actually accredits employers that voluntarily adopt the living wage in their organization. And this is where I got interested in the research as a business ethics scholar, because obviously if you adopt this voluntarily, that's voluntary behavior. And I was interested in the motivations of organizations, of why are they doing this? And I was thinking, if I look into this, how can then my research be used to promote the uptake of the living wage? So I started out very traditionally as a researcher. I published a conceptual piece of a conceptual article in the Journal of Business Ethics, and building on that, I then developed my empirical research, and I was lucky enough to get funded by the Barrow Cadbury Trust, and I was able to conduct an empirical study into the adoption of the living wage in small businesses, which was of interest to me because I've always been interested in the ethics in small businesses, but also they have a relatively high sign-up rate among the living wage accredited employers. I'm currently doing a new project looking more into the adoption of the living wage in adult social care, but I will focus mainly on my SME research. Now, how did I create impact from that empirical research? I first want to explain my pathways to impact. A real cornerstone was the publication of a research report that happened after I finished completing my empirical study. And that was published on the Living Wage Foundation's website, and it got quite a bit of interest. And I talked to business audiences about this. I did training workshops for Living Wage Foundation staff. And as a follow-on, I was also invited to participate in a Living Wage Roundtable organized by Profit for Ethics, which developed a CSR benchmarking framework called Responsible 100. And I was also invited to conduct further research by a service provider company. And here I was asked to look into the impact of the living wage on subcontracted cleaners. So all of this fed into my impact case study for the REF, and here I was able to show what impact my research had made. Now the research, and especially that research report, fed into the work of a lot of campaigning organizations around the world. So it became basically an effective campaign tool. They incorporated my research into their own materials and their own reports, and their work in turn led to a significant increase of living wage accreditations among SMEs in the UK. It led to the adoption of the living wage for core public services workers in New Zealand, and it also led to a policy recommendation at UN level. My research was also used as an organizational communication tool, and that was a follow-up from this research consultancy study that I did, and that workplace and facilities management is using my research as they engage with their clients to actually tender for living wage compliant contracts rather than contracts that don't have a living wage clause. And it also led to an improvement of the living wage benchmark of that Responsible 100 framework. So I'm setting this all out in my impact case study. And briefly on the reflection on challenges, I think what I had to learn is that advocacy organizations have a different logic to academic researchers. So for example, advocacy organizations are interested in straightforward messages. So especially living wage campaigners are interested in sort of messages that relate to the business case for the living wage. Whereas as an academic researcher, I'm more interested in nuanced results and sort of what are sort of different mechanisms in different contexts, different organizational contexts, and where might there be contexts where the living wage simply doesn't work. So I had to get my head around that, but I also learned that if I develop good relationships with these advocacy organizations, they actually value me as an independent person, and my research to them has quite a bit of credibility, because I do come from it from a more neutral perspective and not from their own campaigning perspective. There's a tension for me between the requirement to publish articles in ABS 3-4 journals and achieving impact. And that is mainly to do with the timelines. It takes ages to publish articles in journals, whereas obviously, once you've done an empirical research study on the living wage in SMEs, you want to see the results, you want to publish the results straight away, and you want people to use it. So I think I did a good thing by publishing that research report, but such research reports have obviously no academic kudos. And the final one was that I had to learn that impact creation requires a very distinct skill set to my research skills, to my teaching skills. It was a lot about relationship skills and tenacity, and really trying to engage in a good relationship with those people who were using my research and who could supply me with evidence that my research actually made a difference. That's from me.
That was bang on time. So thank you for setting such an excellent precedent. That was really interesting. I'm sure there are lots of questions, but let's hold those until we are all talking together. I will now hand over to Septi. If you can share your screen. Excellent. Septi, you're muted. Septi, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, sorry, yes. But I was saying hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining our session this afternoon. Labour rights reporting on global value chains, accountability to whom, is something that I've been working in collaboration with Ian Roper, Michael Muller, Carmen, and a number of other colleagues over the past couple of years. So what I'm about to present is a collaborative work and not my own work only. When we think about accountability, in an ideal world, we always think about social reporting should be designed in a way that helps companies to become transparent. And at the end of the day, that should help companies to discharge their accountability to their stakeholders. And ultimately, the goal of social justice is going to be served. But when it comes to labor rights in global value chains, the situation is far from ideal. After the Second World War, there have been lots of international conventions about labor rights, and we regard those as in a transnational public governance. But so far, there hasn't been any international legal framework. What appears to be emerging now are lots of national legislations in different countries to protect labor rights in global value chains of their companies. And these legislations are at their very early stages, and we regard those as national public governance. But challenges to labor writings really appear when we have when we think about globalization, when we think about the voluntary nature of reporting in this area and complexities of global value chains. In terms of globalization, which is here to spread, to stay, it is widespread. Most transnational companies find themselves in a situation where they act as supervising authorities, and that creates a democratic deficit where these transnational companies really end up to decide what is best for their own legitimacy and legitimacy to their institutional investors rather than those of their stakeholders. And they all often end up reporting information that serves their investors' best interests. And this situation is exacerbated by multi-layers of suppliers where they don't know who is in their suppliers. There is an absence of meaningful measurement tools for labor rights, and there is a lack of attention to what really is happening in developing countries, which form a major part of these global value chains. And there is no formal acknowledgement for the engagement with the workforce, which is quite concerning. So it is in this spectrum of private governance mechanisms that transnational companies operate. So ideally, social reporting is what happens in reality is far from ideal. It serves the best interest of investors, really. What we have found most recently in our study is that when we have private governance backed up with public transnational governance, international conventions, there tends to be more consistency in reporting. But what is concerning and what we found is that there is an absence of social governance mechanisms. And by social governance, we don't just mean recognition of NGOs and engagement with them, which the literature argues. We go way beyond that and we say there needs to be a systematic integration and interaction between private governance mechanism and social governance mechanisms. And the first step towards that is that perhaps there should be international conventions or some form of public governance mechanisms to identify the need for free and independent workforce representation, meaningful measurement tools. And I mean, this is something, as I said, we've been working on for over a number of years, but a lot of what I'm saying came kind of to the forefront in the paper that we did in China. And I don't think any other paper has focused on China the way we did, because in China, the concept of human right doesn't exist. This notion of free and independent workforce representation does not exist. China is the second largest country in the world, and we know very little about it. They are very difficult. They intend to remain different to the rest of us. So, you know, how are we going to face those challenges with China? We've received external funding for a Chinese project, and we're hoping to go for more external funding on this. Needless to say that because this topic is very important, this is part of our teaching. It's already taught as part of my modules, undergraduate, postgraduates, and also research. One of our research students is working in similar areas, and master students are working in this area as well. So thank you very much, and that's it for me.
That's great. Thank you, Sepide. That was well in time as well. So I will now move on to Richard. We've had a slight change in the order. Richard, when you are ready.
Thank you very much. Just put it into present. Right, so good afternoon, everyone. Introduce myself. So as Sean explained at the start, I'm a doctoral research student, so this is my first time presenting at any of these sorts of academic forums, so be gentle. My day job is as the Procurement Development Manager for the John Lewis Partnership, so that's covering John Lewis and Waitrose retail brands in the UK and the what we call goods not for resale global supply chain. My research is looking at achieving behavioural change. Bit of content, but we'll skip through that. The actual research, why did I think this was a good idea? I have about 10 years, just over 10 years of procurement delivery experience. So negotiating contracts, sourcing suppliers, managing supplier relationships. And within that experience, I've been able to see the potential and the power and the role that procurement can play within a supply chain network on behalf of customers, on behalf of their organization, and the influence that those roles have over whether or not a supply chain is ethical. That meant for me that we were in a particularly unique position, and the topic of sustainability is gaining more and more traction from an ethical perspective, from an environmental and climate perspective, and from a social perspective as well. So for me, there was a nice opportunity to be a practitioner and a researcher in this instance. I am part of the department that I am trying to implement change within. So a lot of my research is reflective and observational. In terms of the objectives, from an organizational perspective, we are aiming to achieve an improvement in our attitudes, very much feeling that controlling the inputs will then deliver better outputs for us. And then from an academic perspective, I am exploring the efficacy of a particular appreciative action research model in the context that I'm working in. So that's in procurement, relating to sustainability, and within an employee-owned organization. For those who don't know, the John Lewis Partnership is one of the biggest retailers in the UK. There is the John Lewis brand, which is general merchandise, and Waitrose, which is a grocery retailer. Turnover is just over £10 billion a year, and there's about 80,000 employees within the business. We are all co-owners of the business, so we are known as partners. There are no shareholders. We're not a publicly traded entity. So it provides a unique environment from a corporate governance perspective, because a lot of our controls are done through democracy internally. From a goods not for resale for the procurement function, it's 65 people, sorry, and 1.4 to 1.5 billion pounds worth of spend per annum. So there's a lot of opportunity to influence there. But also within the change context, I started my research in December 2019, which meant just after I ran my baseline, COVID hit, and that was fun. We have had a new chairman and an almost entirely new executive leadership team. We've gone through, or are going through, a major headcount reduction. So 30% of our head office staff are being made redundant. And from a procurement perspective, we're implementing a new digital and source to settle system, which is going to transform the way that we assure our supply chain. So massive changes going on within the business at the same time that I'm trying to implement a behavioral change program. Just on that baseline, this is just for information, but when I started the research, very few of our projects within GNFR procurement actually secured any kind of CSR commitment. At this point, within the baseline, there's no clear single definition of sustainable procurement that is available within the partnership. Everyone interprets it slightly differently, and you can see some of those on the right-hand side, that graph showing the types of commitments that were secured, if any, cut across a number of different areas and categories that could be considered within sustainable procurement. In terms of participant groups, the baseline was the entire department, the entire procurement department, and also ran a separate survey with external procurement professionals to see where the partnership sat. But one of the things that I've had to deal with throughout the project, as I've alluded to, is consistently changing demographics within the business. So the participant groups have had to change. As I said, we've gone through or going through a major head office restructure. The procurement department started, when I started my research, we were 85 people, and we're down to 65. So we have to accept that there is a changing landscape going on around us, and that has been quite difficult to maintain a consistent group of individuals participating in the research, but an inevitability of the business environment. People do move around, people change roles on a regular basis. In terms of early reflections, my research is still ongoing. Hopefully, I will submit it towards the end of this calendar year. But these are reflections so far in terms of trying to create and make change. First off, people are skeptical of my motives. They do think I'm trying to create change because of the research rather than the research is looking at how easy or not it is to create change. From a revolution versus evolution, I like this phrase just because there seems to be a real big difference in expectation as to how fast change should be made. People expect change to happen, or they expect the new scenario tomorrow, but they also expect to have the opportunity to contribute, criticize, critique, tear it apart, put it back together again. So there's a real disparity between expectations there. And also the mental capacity as well. What I'm observing at the moment is that leaders within the organization seem to only be able to cope with 1 or 2 large-scale change projects at any one time, mentally. But at a lower level, partners, coalface people are able to deal with quite a lot of different change projects, depending on how they are put to them. And then I also like this phrase from Brown, Harris, and Russell, the distillation of interdependencies. So from their book, Wicked Problems, or Tackling Wicked Problems, the fact that the research change, anything cannot happen within isolation. And I've certainly had to deal with COVID. COVID made my baseline take a step back. So where partners thought it was very important we act sustainably, running that baseline again in May, June time last year, fewer partners thought sustainability was important. So 6 months after I started my research, I'd already lost ground in trying to achieve sustainable behaviors, but them's the breaks. Sorry, I'm very conscious of time, so I'll stop there, but very much open to questions later on. Thanks, Sian.
Great, thank you so much. That was well timed. And now, that was the timer, in fact. I'll now move on to Tim, who is going to present research that he has been conducting with Lillian. I'm not sure if Lillian's going to offer her own presentation contribution.
Thank you very much, Sian. I'll put my slides up in just a second. Lillian is here, and I'm sure she'll wish to contribute to questions as well, but I'll give the presentation.
Okay.
I have to speak to people then later on. Let's find this presentation. Bear with me a second. I've got rather a lot of windows open. There we go. Right. Let's start this. Okay. Slightly different format to this one. I'll stick to the 7 minutes, but what I'm going to report on are some impacts that were included in an impact case study for the REF, which is just concluded. So it's a bit of a retrospective cast. So we'll look back on some impacts and try and trace how those were developed over time, the decisions that we made in order to get ourselves to the point to be able to put in that impact, so to contribute to that impact study, and some reflections on the process. I'll try and, a voice of experience, and draw Lillian in as well, because I should say I'm very much a Johnny come lately on this. There are 8 other people involved in this. It's not just me by any way. So I'll draw other people in and point to the contributions of many people along the way. So the substantive area was in sexual and reproductive health of women migrant workers. And well, why are we doing this? Well, it's substantively important in its own right, but it also links into various global policy initiatives. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example, it fits into SDG 3 on health and SDG 5 on equality and gender empowerment. So it's very much of its time. It's global, it's a way of contributing on a global stage. And we also know that there are, from wider empirical literature, there are positive correlations between ability to regulate fertility and a range of other important and positive outcomes like earning an income, educational attainment, employment, job mobility, promotion, keep going, until you run out of supply. So it's important for many reasons, and that importance is recognised globally. So hence the projects. A little bit about the region. Malaysia itself is the regional ASEAN destination for women migrant workers. It's a net importer. It's the place where most of the migrant workers are seeking their employment outside of their countries of origin. It's quite large. There are 2.5 to 3 million women migrant workers, according to the World Bank. That's the largest estimate. It's probably the most accurate as well, because it takes account of a whole series of other things that some of the official stats don't. these women tend to be concentrated in low-skilled, low-paid sectors. So the main two there are domestic labour and factory work. And in Malaysia, the migration room is quite intolerant of SRH needs. So the most stark example is if you are not allowed to be pregnant as a migrant worker. And if you are found to be pregnant in the yearly tests, then you lose your contract and you're deported. So there are serious consequences here. It's a very intolerant regime. That testing is annual, contracts tend to be rolling. So you might, on a biannual basis, go for 3, 4, 5 of those. I think the guillotine is 10 years. So it's unstable, it's cyclical and an intolerant regime. And the wider, it's predominantly conservative in terms of sexual mores, largely patriarchal, and SRH knowledge is generally low. That's above that's in the migrant population, but also the general population as well. So it's a real need. It's globally recognised. It's important. Millions of people are implicated. Fine, it's a real thing. In terms of our research, what did we do? I said this was retrospective casts. So I've given you on the left-hand side the inputs to this. These are externally funded projects. So this is what we did and who was funding what we did. And on the right-hand side, they're the outputs that are in terms of the publications and other things that enabled us to gain traction in the world and for our research to be recognised and for things to happen. So just quickly, if you look at that left-hand side, you'll see, 2015, so 5-6 years ago, was the first of these British Council awards looking at meeting social welfare needs. That's the start of this. The second one, having done that, being seen as credible actors, Sue and Lillian and Bianca, credible actors in the area. Lillian was then able to get an additional grant from the UN Gender Theme Group to do additional work on sexual reproductive health rights specifically. So there you go. So you do one thing, you get known for it, you win a grant because you're known for it, you do other work, and you draw in other people who are experts in the area that you wish to work with. Next one then is a strategy paper. On the back of that, again, Lillian gets even more widely known and becomes an even more credible actor on the stage. And she brought me in at that point. We got some money from the UN Women to do some further work, which was policy oriented. And that policy was about for the UN to develop a strategy within Malaysia around sexual and reproductive health rights. That's a commissioned piece of work by an advocacy agency to get into the policy arena directly. So that was nice of them to do that. It was good and something we could do. And the final one, number one, is for on the back of that to be doing some intervention work within the factories to get to improve SRH and to get a model which is then portable. So I guess project zero is going to be then, having done that and tested it, to then have a dissemination activity beyond it. So it builds through time, so I'm suggesting. So a couple of things. One, it builds through time. And two, different people involved at different parts of the process, and you build on the expertise. The constant thread in this is Lillian, which is the one that's driving all of this. And you can see the skill that has been involved in getting people in at different points based on their expertise, based on what they can add to it, and then moving it forward. So those are our inputs. The outputs, I'll draw attention to a couple of those. Number 5, that toolkit to promote sexual and reproductive health. That was a report to funder. That was a thing that enabled us to be credible in putting a bid to be doing interventions, because we've got this sexual health toolkit of interventions that currently are. We know the gaps. Let us then work with NGOs to do new ones and better ones. So that's a key output, number 5. What's the other one to draw attention to? The other one's number 3, the strategy paper SDG 5 for the UN. That was the policy arena paper, so that enables you to gain traction in policy arenas. You'll notice both of those outputs are not academic outputs. They are reports to funders to gain us the traction in that area. We've got the, we've got the 4s and the 3s and whatever ABS list stuff on the right as well, but they're not the ones that gave us traction to gain us to do particular work. So an important point, maybe a little bit more on that later. Just hide my free floating meeting control so I can see what that title says. How do we create impact? Lots of people give you the advice. I've been to a number of seminars and conferences where people tell you how to do this. Some are more helpful than others. The really good ones, the best ones in my opinion anyway, are the ones that teach you the rational planning bit up front, because you need to do that. It needs to be a conscious process. But in addition to that, enable you to see how you need to think on your feet. and how you need to respond to opportunities as they arise, how you can develop things over time. That's really, really useful to have. The way I think about this is Mintzberg's reflections on strategy, particularly emergent strategy. So strategizing isn't just something that you plan out with your pens and then you do it, but it's emergent and you gain insights retrospectively and you build it. So you both recast your mind and then almost rewrite your strategy after you've done it. Is the simplification. It's not quite that simple. It doesn't quite capture everything, but there's an important issue in terms of narrating your strategy retrospectively to inform what you then go to do. So this iteration of past and future, I think, is really helpful. And you'll see what we did then. We identified, we did important stakeholder engagement work and getting known, really got ourselves known with all the right people, all the right contacts. It identified the importance of capacity building and workplace solutions, and then having generated those networks, responded quickly, incredibly, with bids through the people that needed to be on the particular bids in order to do so, which gets you in a position through and over time, when you reflect backwards, to shape national policy strategies in Project 2 and to design those interventions, Project 1. So you kind of see how it comes together over time. There's patterns in a stream of decisions, this ability to react to what is available and what is there quickly, and to be thinking about what's next, a couple of steps before you have to do it, and then be able to respond at the same time. So it's a tricky business, but it's a lot of fun. That's what I'm trying to get over in all of that. So our impact then, as I said before, you look at this impact case study number 7, there's a strand in extending maternity protection and reproductive rights to these SRH, and that's the work I've presented here today. And the two main things are, one, influencing the implementation of those national strategies through output 3, that commission work from the UN, and secondly, building that stakeholder capacity to develop firm level responses of, here's a new training scheme, let's pilot it. So we knew all the people then in Malaysia. You already worked with them and identified them. You get them in to co-write the bid, the co-applicants on the bid for the money from British Council. You're a credible actor because you've got the right people there. Everyone knows you, and you've got a better chance then. It doesn't always work, but you give yourself the best chance to do it. Reflection on challenges. Yeah, impact and academic publications are distinct yet complementary. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Different audiences need different things in order to be able to respond positively to you, to give you things that you might want to gain access to allow you to have that impact. You'll notice that our ABS 3s, 4s and 2s and whatever in the academic literature are not the ones that primarily enabled us to gain traction with third sector organisations to be able to do things. They're important, don't get me wrong, but sometimes academic qualifications can come afterwards in that step of doing new work and building constituencies, and sometimes they come before and you use those to build on and do other things. And the fact that they're out there, you can reference them in your application, it's not a bad thing. But similarly, reports and other things that are not academic publications can also be really helpful. Second point, plan from the outset, fantastic, really, really good, but don't lose sight of the emergent strategy and the need to respond to circumstance as it arises, and to be thinking about how best to do that. Thirdly, relationships with stakeholders. That's a wide range of stakeholders, not only the funders and other academics, but third sector agencies, practice professionals who can also be co-applicants. They are crucial. You can take them with you from one project to another project if that's the progression. Be thinking about the project progression. Be careful, as with any relationship. You need to maintain, you need to build it through time, you need to be responsible and all of that, otherwise it will fall apart right in front of your horizon very quickly. So there's work to be done, is what I'm suggesting. And it's important to recognise and acknowledge the different needs of a range of stakeholders as well. So, everyone wants different things out of this. If we talk about impact, what is the impact here? Well, academics, is this an ABS 4 or an ABS 3 publication? What's the size of this grant and who's going to fund it? That's a kind of academic concern, but advocates and participants couldn't care less often. Sometimes they do and can give you credibility. So again, some crossover here, but the fact that they have a campaign and a program of work that you can be helpful with, great, some synergy, possibilities for synergy. And then you need to manage carefully those boundaries. So you need to keep the relationships going, you need to be offering something, but you also need to have that amount of credibility to be able to say no, and that can be tricky. Happy to talk about that a little bit in the conversation. I think that'll do. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. So that is our presentations. And now I'll hand over to Clive to offer his reflections and maybe some discussion starting points relating to the relationship between the research and the impact on practice and the impact on the real world. Over to you, Clive.
Thank you so much, Sean. And can I thank you and Andrea for setting this session up. I think this is really incredibly perceptive, very brave, and a great opportunity. And to also thank our three other speakers, as well as Andrea, for excellent presentations. And it's always a struggle, but you've kept pretty well to time. I'll try and follow in that same footsteps. Just if for those of you who don't know me anyway, I think I need to say a little bit about background and my interest in this whole area. I started off my career after university as a civil engineer, and I found myself on Barbican redevelopment in the early 60s, working for John Lang, and it was an amazing experience to find that we had incredibly good engineers, architects and others contributing to the project, but not John Lang's fault, I might quickly say, but on the projects generally, which is an enormous project of its time, rebuilding in the City of London, the labour relations situation was chaotic, absolutely awful. And those of you who know a bit about industrial relations history in the UK and in construction will know that there was a Ministry of Labour Court of Inquiry set up because of the chaotic situation on many of the sites there. Anyway, cut long story short, because of my studies and my interest, I actually went for a postgraduate degree part-time at London School of Economics and ended up as a PhD studying 4,000 disputes on Barbican and Moorfields, a big block next to it, which was BP's headquarters, and Paternoster development next to St Paul's. And Langs were very good. They gave me an incredible amount of information. But that led to a welding, as far as I was concerned, between academic research and the practical world that we live in. And I've always been thoroughly in favour of research going alongside practice, and each one feeding into the other. Now, when we come to this whole area of corporate social responsibility, I'm going to jump because later in my career, I was director of HR and also PR for a Japanese company in the Northeast, which was an inward investing company. It set up a plant in the Northeast for making large excavators and other earth-moving equipment. Lovely story for myself on its own. But in terms of CSR, I want to emphasize that a lot of this, I believe, with CSR is an issue of opportunity. Companies and business do not immediately think CSR is their first priority. Their first priority is to run their business effectively, to make sure that they have a future, because the director's first priority in law is to ensure the future of the company. So CSR does not naturally occur, and I think we need to recognize this, that we have to look for opportunities and we have to look for research influencing those opportunities. Now, I had a history before I got to that particular point in the middle 80s of being involved in the whole issue of people with disabilities being at work or finding work. And Komatsu, this company, this Japanese company I ended up working for, when they bought this second-hand plant, had a rather palatial block at the front of the site, which was originally used by the American company Caterpillar for its executives. The Japanese didn't want management and labour in separate buildings. They wanted white collar, blue collar alongside each other, which I was absolutely convinced of, and it was a wonderful opportunity. But it left this block redundant. It had a flat roof, the roof was leaking, it had little ventilation. And I kept on saying to my Japanese colleagues, if you don't do anything with this, you're going to end up demolishing it in 5 years' time. And then I went to one of these business breakfast things where they give you coffee and croissant and that sort of stuff. And Ken Clarke, politician here, was then Minister for Inner Cities, and he had come to encourage us to do things. And to cut it long story short, he said, if you've got a project, we'll meet you halfway. So I went straight to his minions in the Department of Employment and said, look, I've got a project, can you help me? And they were wonderful. They found £200,000 for refurbishing this building. I then got match funding from Tokyo, and we converted it into a project for those with disabilities and getting those with disabilities into work. So that's just a short story. I'm going to whip on to another one. When I later went as HR director in Anglian Water, I walked into something called the Transformation Programme, where they were trying to get a massive change program going throughout the whole organisation to encourage people to really extend their abilities and their experience. And they put them into teams and they said, you can choose any project you like, doesn't matter, you choose the project. And so many of the projects ended up with community projects where they were helping a village, it might have been a part of a town, whatever, in what we would call CSR terms. It wasn't labelled that then. And then later on, we as directors had a presentation from Baines, the consulting company, about new strategic developments in extending our particular areas into other fields of business. And these consultants said, look, we've got some news for you. Your customers trust you. Excuse this extraneous noise. And everybody said, oh, and of course they had their own theories as to why that should be. But these consultants said, your customers trust you because of the work you've been doing in the community. And that gave us a platform for extending our business outside water into other areas. So there are two examples which were opportunities, which actually knowledge from outside influenced. So I think when we come to the whole issue of corporate social responsibility, what is impressing on companies today is firstly license to operate, the issue of reputation, the issue of relationships, the issue of trust and ethical and moral case. So basically, those are things that are becoming imperatives. And now we come to our excellent presentations. In terms of the expression of how these things make impact, I was particularly impressed with Andrea's approach, where you've got a policy which would seem to be against the instinct of business. Why should you pay more for somebody doing the same job? And that seems like an incredibly high cliff to climb. So Andrea's analysis there and support was actually, I see, in two ways. The PR impact of accreditation. There's an accreditation pull. It's a bit like, in my mind, investors in people or something like that, a badge. And then there's the awareness, the campaign, the advocacy impact. And this is where I believe research comes in extremely strongly. Because researchers, as you've articulated between you, actually come with independence and credibility. researchers also come with an ability to benchmark. What do other people do? They come with factual reporting and credibility in that sense. And independent of companies, the ability to see trends and highlight opportunities and discover with these trends and expose those opportunities. So Andrea, I think, has shown that immediately. And then we come, just trying to find my notes here, to Cepida's brilliant exposure of corporate accountability. And in terms of labour rights reporting, why should companies do it? It's only national. Why there's not any great compulsion about this? So we come to the social accountability, and we come back to the starting point of credibility of the reputation of those companies. So I think that Cepida is very carefully and correctly focused with this whole issue of globalization, of the voluntary nature of reporting and the complexity of supply chains. And I would make the point with supply chains that if you have an organization, as I experienced with the Japanese, which actually is very willing to look across boundaries in supply chains with integration, I would put to you a thesis, if you like, that if they're going to do that within companies, they are culturally probably more willing to look across boundaries in a CSR sense. So the outputs for Cepida, of course, with the corporate governance code and others in national settings and in the UN, I think can be very powerful. And I've worked with a company organization, it's a think tank called Tomorrow's Company, and that has actually advocated these things for something like 30 years now. So then we come to Richard in John Lewis Partnership. And of course, as you'll see from my background, I can very much relate to this issue of being both a practitioner and researcher. And that brings benefits, but it actually brings issues, as Richard has shown there. And to focus on this goods not for resale area, I think it's very interesting, because you quite rightly, Richard, have talked about in business the challenges, the change in attitude, and in academic terms, by using appreciative action, the issue can be looking for an opportunity that I've mentioned earlier on. So that I think some very good learning points. And then in terms of Tim's work with Lillian, this I think is a very difficult area, because with the research that you've both done and the reports you produced, you could ask from a national, international point of view, why should anybody take any notice? Because those individual companies are not motivated to change. And you, I think, have quite rightly gone in at national level to influence policies, and then also to influence stakeholder capacity. And my issue really with that research, and a question to Tim, as I might like to start off with, that work at national level and the stakeholder capacity, has this actually made a difference in those individual companies at the level in which they actually implement policies and hopefully change policies? So that's my introduction. Sorry, that was probably a little bit too long, but now, Sean, can I hand over to you, because you're going to handle the questions, I think.